Your species sabotaged the laws of war. The accusation echoed through the frozen air of Velkor Prime, but hours earlier the battlefield had been silent in a way no one in the galaxy expected. A wind colder than -60 degrees swept across a stretch of ice nearly 2 miles wide, rattling the metal hulls of abandoned vehicles and whispering through shattered antenna towers that leaned like tired giants in the snow. Above the horizon, 3 alien cruisers hovered motionless, their engines glowing faint blue against the endless gray sky. They had arrived expecting victory reports, expecting confirmation that the human battalion stationed here had been wiped out according to standard galactic combat doctrine. Instead, their scanners found something impossible. Movement. Not combat formations. Not weapons charging. Just figures moving slowly through the drifting frost. When the first observation drones descended through the clouds, their cameras captured a scene that would soon circulate through every command network in the system. Human soldiers walked across the battlefield without raising a single rifle. Some knelt beside injured alien troops, carefully wrapping thermal blankets around armored shoulders. Others carried portable heaters across the snow, planting them between groups of exhausted soldiers from both sides. One human medic poured water from a dented steel canteen into the hands of an alien pilot whose flight suit was rimmed with ice. No one fired. No alarm sounded. Even the wind seemed to pause as if the planet itself was confused by what it was seeing. At the center of it all stood Major Lucas Hale. 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, a white human officer whose dark winter coat snapped softly in the storm. Frost clung to the edges of his beard as he scanned the field through a small handheld scope. Around him the battlefield stretched for miles, silent except for the crunch of boots in snow nearly 8 inches deep. One of his lieutenants approached, visor glowing faintly in the dim light. "Sir," the officer said quietly, glancing toward a cluster of alien soldiers being guided toward warming shelters. "Fleet Command will see this. According to galactic law, we're supposed to maintain combat containment until enemy forces surrender." Hale lowered the scope slowly. The distant cruisers in orbit reflected off the ice like cold stars watching from above. For a moment he said nothing. Then he looked across the field at the exhausted figures stumbling through the frost and gave a small nod. "Yeah," Hale said calmly, his breath turning to white fog in the air. "I know the law." The lieutenant hesitated. "Then why are we doing this?" Hale allowed himself the faintest smile as he watched a human medic help an alien soldier stand up in the snow. "Because," he said quietly, "sometimes the law forgets what war is supposed to protect." Above them, the alien cruisers continued recording every second of the impossible scene, unaware that within hours this quiet moment on a frozen world would ignite the most controversial trial in galactic history. The storm on Velkor Prime did not calm when the alien cruisers arrived in orbit, but the silence on the ground grew heavier with every passing minute. Snow drifted across the battlefield in slow white waves, collecting along the edges of supply crates and the boots of soldiers who only hours earlier had stood on opposite sides of a conflict neither truly understood. Now those same soldiers sat together beside portable heaters that glowed faint orange against the frozen ground. Human medics moved carefully between them, checking thermal readings and passing out insulated rations designed to function in temperatures below -50 degrees Fahrenheit. The alien troops watched in cautious confusion. Their doctrine was clear. War had rules. Once battle lines formed, assistance to the opposing side was considered a violation of combat balance. Yet the humans moved through the field as if none of those rules existed. One young alien technician studied the steaming metal cup placed in his hands, turning it slowly as if it might be some kind of trap. Across from him, a human medic adjusted the heating unit and gave a calm nod. No threats. No weapons raised. Just quiet work in the freezing wind. Nearly 2 miles away, Major Lucas Hale stood beside a field transmitter mounted on the roof of a supply crawler half buried in snow. The device hummed softly as it pushed a signal through the atmosphere toward the orbiting fleet. The lieutenant from earlier approached again, brushing ice from his shoulder plates. His voice remained careful. "Sir, long-range scanners confirm 3 command cruisers watching us. Their systems are recording everything happening here." Hale did not look up from the tablet in his gloved hands. On the screen, a map of the battlefield showed dozens of blinking life Signals scattered across the ice. Human and alien positions overlapped now, forming clusters of shared heat signatures where soldiers gathered around portable generators. Good, Hale said quietly. Then they will see exactly what we did. The lieutenant hesitated before speaking again. Fleet Command on Earth will receive those recordings as well. They might question the decision. Hale finally lifted his gaze toward the distant sky. Even through the gray cloud layer, the faint glow of the cruisers could be seen, like 3 cold stars refusing to blink. They probably will, he said. The lieutenant folded his arms against the wind. And the alien command will accuse us of breaking their war doctrine. Hale allowed a faint breath of fog to escape his lips. That part is guaranteed. A few hundred yards away, 2 human engineers finished assembling a temporary shelter, guiding a group of exhausted alien soldiers inside, where the heaters glowed brighter. The wind pushed snow across the entrance, but the structure held steady. Hale watched the scene for several seconds before speaking again. You know what the strange thing about laws is, Lieutenant? The officer shook his head slowly. Hale tapped the screen on his tablet, marking another group of survivors for medical pickup. Most laws are written by people who have never stood in the middle of what they are trying to control. The lieutenant looked across the frozen field where human and alien soldiers now shared the same narrow line of warmth in a world that could freeze exposed metal solid in less than 5 minutes. Sir, he said carefully, when the galaxy sees this, they are going to call it sabotage. Hale slipped the tablet into his coat and stepped down from the crawler, boots crunching into the snow. He looked once more toward the distant cruisers above the clouds, and then back to the field of quiet cooperation spreading across nearly 2 miles of frozen ground. Maybe, he said calmly. But sometimes the only way to fix a broken system is to show everyone what it looks like when someone refuses to follow it. Far above Velkor Prime, the alien cruisers continued recording every moment, unaware that their footage was already being transmitted across the network that would soon summon Major Lucas Hale to a courtroom where the meaning of war itself would be questioned. The footage from Velkor Prime traveled farther than Major Lucas Hale expected. Within 12 hours, the recordings had crossed 3 star systems and landed inside the secure archives of the Galactic War Council. The images were simple but impossible to ignore. Human soldiers walking through a battlefield without raising a weapon. Portable heaters glowing against snow that measured nearly 10 inches deep. Alien troops sitting beside the very soldiers they had been ordered to fight only hours earlier. Analysts replayed the footage again and again, zooming into every movement as if the explanation might be hidden in a reflection of ice or a gesture of a gloved hand. Instead, they found the same quiet pattern repeating across the 2-mile battlefield. Cooperation, not domination. Order where chaos was expected. The council chambers on Arcturus Station filled quickly as representatives from dozens of species gathered around the circular chamber of dark glass and silver light. In the center of the room, a holographic projection rose from the floor, showing the frozen surface of Velkor Prime in perfect detail. Snow moved across the battlefield exactly as it had that day, swirling around the small orange glow of human heating units placed between soldiers of opposing sides. Murmurs spread through the chamber. One council observer spoke first. This is a violation of Article 77. Combat neutrality protocols require the preservation of strategic pressure until surrender is formally declared. Another voice answered from across the chamber. Yet the data shows no hostile escalation following the event. The first observer turned back toward the projection. That is irrelevant. The law is clear. The debate continued for nearly an hour before the chamber doors finally opened. 2 human security officers stepped forward, escorting Major Lucas Hale into the room. He walked calmly across the polished floor, boots echoing once against the metal before falling silent on the central platform. The chamber lights dimmed slightly as the projection shifted. The frozen battlefield faded away, replaced by a single image taken from one of the alien cruisers in orbit. It showed Hale standing beside the supply crawler while soldiers from both sides gathered near the heating shelters. Judge Commander Sarenval rose from her seat at the far side of the chamber. Her tall frame was outlined by pale blue skin and the formal silver uniform worn only by senior arbiters of the War Council. Her eyes studied the human officer with careful precision. Major Lucas, Hale of Earth Defense Command, she said, her voice steady and clear enough to carry through the entire chamber. "You stand before this council to explain your actions on Velkor Prime." Hale placed his hands behind his back, posture relaxed but respectful. Around him, dozens of alien representatives watched without blinking. The holographic battlefield still glowed above them like a frozen memory, suspended in air. Vol continued. "Our records confirm that during an active engagement you ordered the suspension of all tactical pressure and provided aid to enemy forces prior to surrender." She paused for a moment, allowing the chamber to absorb the weight of the statement. Under galactic war doctrine, that action is classified as interference with the natural balance of combat. Hale lifted his eyes toward the projection of the battlefield where the small heaters still glowed in the drifting snow. For a few seconds he said nothing. The chamber remained completely still. Then Major Lucas Hale spoke quietly. "With respect," he said, "that depends on what you believe war is supposed to accomplish." The chamber did not react immediately to Major Lucas Hale's words. The silence that followed stretched across the circular hall like a held breath. Above the platform, the holographic battlefield of Velkor Prime continued to drift slowly in pale light, snow crossing the frozen ground, while small clusters of human and alien soldiers gathered around portable heaters. Judge Commander Vol studied the human officer without blinking. Her voice remained calm, but carried the quiet weight of authority earned through decades of arbitration. "War," she replied slowly, "exists to resolve conflict through controlled force. The laws governing it ensure balance, predictability, and strategic order between civilizations." Hale nodded slightly, as if acknowledging a familiar lecture. Around the chamber, several council members shifted in their seats, their eyes moving between the projection and the lone human standing below it. Vol continued. "Your actions on Velkor Prime disrupted that order. By assisting enemy forces before formal surrender, you interfered with the equilibrium established by galactic combat doctrine. Such interference creates uncertainty in future engagements." Hale glanced up at the projection again. The frozen field glowed softly above him, the heaters appearing as faint points of warmth against endless white. For a moment he seemed less interested in the council and more focused on the memory itself. "May I ask something, Commander?" he said quietly. Vol tilted her head slightly. "You may." Hale folded his hands behind his back. "How many of you in this chamber have actually stood on a battlefield where the temperature drops below -60 degrees Fahrenheit? A ripple of quiet murmurs moved through the council seats. Some representatives exchanged glances. Others remained perfectly still. Hale continued speaking before anyone answered. "When the wind starts cutting across open ground at 40 miles per hour, metal freezes solid in minutes. If you touch bare steel with exposed skin, it will take the heat from your body before you realize what happened. Batteries fail. Optics frost over. And every breath you take feels like inhaling shards of glass." The holographic projection shifted slightly, zooming closer to the center of the battlefield. Snow moved in slow currents between the figures standing around the heating shelters. Hale gestured lightly toward the image. "That is the environment you wrote your laws for. From a distance, on comfortable stations orbiting warm stars." Vol watched him carefully. Her voice remained steady. "And yet those laws have maintained stability across dozens of civilizations." Hale nodded again. "I am sure they have." He looked up at the projection where a human medic could be seen helping an alien soldier adjust a thermal blanket. But on Velkor Prime, stability looked a little different. The chamber lights dimmed slightly as the system replayed a portion of the recorded footage. Human soldiers guiding alien survivors toward portable heaters. Supply crates opened and shared. No raised weapons. No tactical formations. Only quiet cooperation spreading across nearly 2 miles of frozen ground. Hale spoke again, his tone calm but firm. "You call that interference with combat balance." He paused briefly. From where we were standing, it looked like survival. Several council members leaned forward now, their attention fixed entirely on the human officer. Vol crossed her hands behind her back, her expression thoughtful but unreadable. "Major Hale," she said slowly, "are you suggesting that the laws of war established by this council are flawed?" Hale allowed a faint breath to escape, the smallest hint of a smile touching the corner of his expression as he looked once more at the frozen battlefield above them. "No," he said quietly. I am suggesting they were written by people who forgot what the people inside the war actually look like. The chamber remained quiet after Major Lucas Hale finished speaking, but the silence felt different now. It was no longer the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of people realizing a conversation had just changed direction. Above the council platform, the frozen battlefield of Velkor Prime continued to drift slowly in holographic light. Hale gestured toward the cluster of figures near the heaters. Our battalion had enough portable heat units to maintain operational capacity. The opposing force did not. Sarenval watched the image carefully. You are suggesting environmental factors influenced your command decision. Hale nodded. Not influenced. He paused briefly before finishing the thought. Determined. The projection shifted again, replaying the moment when human soldiers began carrying heaters across the snow toward alien positions. Hale's voice remained steady as he spoke. Your doctrine assumes both sides remain functional long enough for strategic pressure to resolve the engagement. He looked up at the chamber seats surrounding him. On Velkor Prime, the environment was about to end the battle before either side could. One of the council observers spoke quietly. So you altered the battlefield conditions. Hale gave a small shrug beneath his heavy coat. You could say that. Sarenval studied him carefully. Major Hale, what you described could also be interpreted as interference with the natural conclusion of combat. Hale allowed a faint breath of air to escape as he glanced once more at the projection of soldiers gathered around the glowing heaters. Commander, he said quietly, when the planet itself is about to freeze everyone standing on it, the idea of a natural conclusion becomes a little complicated. The chamber lights dimmed slightly as the projection continued to replay the frozen field of Velkor Prime. And for the first time the council members were no longer watching it like observers of a violation, but like witnesses to a question they had never been asked before. Snow moved across the battlefield in long, quiet waves, drifting around the shapes of soldiers sitting beside the glowing heaters that human engineers had planted across nearly 2 miles of ice. The image zoomed closer, revealing details the council had overlooked earlier. A human medic checking the temperature reading on a portable scanner. An alien pilot slowly flexing stiff fingers near the warmth of a heating unit. 2 soldiers from different species adjusting the same generator so the fuel line would not freeze in the wind. Major Lucas Hale stood beneath the projection with his hands behind his back, watching the same scene with calm patience. Judge Commander Sarenval studied the image carefully before turning her attention back to him. Major Hale, she said, your explanation suggests that environmental collapse forced you to alter the battlefield conditions. Yet the doctrine of combat balance exists precisely to prevent one side from manipulating the outcome. Hale nodded slightly, as if he understood the argument well. That would be true, he replied quietly, if the outcome you are protecting is victory. The chamber shifted again with faint murmurs. Sarenval narrowed her eyes slightly. Clarify your statement. Hale glanced up at the projection where the snow continued drifting across the field. Your doctrine assumes war is a competition between 2 forces, he said. Pressure one side until they surrender. Preserve the balance long enough for that surrender to happen. He paused briefly before continuing. But Velkor Prime was not behaving like a battlefield anymore. It was behaving like a freezer. A few council members exchanged looks at the blunt description. Hale continued calmly. The storm system that day was expanding across the entire combat zone. Our weather sensors showed a pressure drop that would push wind speeds past 50 miles per hour within 90 minutes. The projection updated automatically, displaying the recorded atmospheric data beside the battlefield map. The numbers confirmed his statement. Hale gestured lightly toward the information. At that point it would not matter who controlled the supply ridge. It would not matter who had tactical advantage. Both forces would have been trapped in the same storm. One of the observers leaned forward. You are claiming the environment would have ended the battle regardless of strategy. Hale gave a small nod. Exactly. Sarenval stepped closer to the platform, her voice steady but thoughtful. Yet instead of withdrawing your battalion, you chose to assist the opposing force. Hale allowed a faint smile to appear. Commander, withdrawing would have left them exposed. He looked up again at the holographic field where the heaters glowed like small stars scattered across the snow. And once the storm reached full intensity, even our equipment would have struggled to keep up. The chamber fell quiet again. Hale spoke slowly now. making sure every word carried through the hall. So the choice in front of me was simple. Follow doctrine and let the environment decide the outcome. Or change the conditions so everyone standing on that ice had a chance to walk away from it. He lowered his gaze back to the council. From my perspective, that decision did not sabotage the balance of war. He paused for a moment before finishing. The thought. It reminded war what it was supposed to be protecting. Above them the projection continued, showing the frozen battlefield where human and alien soldiers shared the same fragile circles of warmth while the storm gathered beyond the horizon. The chamber no longer sounded like a courtroom. It sounded like a room full of people trying to rethink something they had believed for centuries. Above Major Lucas Hale, the holographic battlefield of Velkor Prime rotated slowly, the system replaying additional sensor logs that had not been shown earlier in the session. New data lines appeared beside the frozen terrain. Atmospheric pressure collapse, thermal failure projections, wind expansion patterns stretching across the entire 2-mile combat zone. The numbers were calm and precise, but their meaning was impossible to ignore. The storm had not been a background detail. It had been the true force shaping the battlefield that day. Judge Commander Sarenval studied the information carefully while the chamber lights reflected softly across the polished floor. Several council members leaned closer to their consoles as the system advanced the timeline of events. The projection now displayed the 90-minute window Major Hale had described. At first the field looked unchanged. Human and alien units positioned across the ice. Heat signatures scattered between supply vehicles and tactical markers. Then the storm indicators intensified. Wind speed projections climbed. Surface temperature dropped further. The model predicted what would have happened if no action had been taken. One by one the heat signatures faded from the projection as the simulation advanced. Not from combat. From exposure. The chamber remained silent as the simulation reached the projected end of the engagement. In the model, the battlefield eventually became empty, the wind still moving across the same frozen surface where two armies had once stood. The system paused automatically. Sarenval slowly turned her attention back toward the human officer. Her voice remained composed, but there was a different tone beneath it now. Major Hale, the environmental simulation confirms that the storm would have escalated beyond operational tolerance. Hale nodded once. Yes, Commander. One of the council observers spoke quietly from the upper tier. Under those conditions, the engagement would have ended without formal surrender from either side. Hale looked up toward the speaker. That was our assessment. Another council member added, which means the doctrine of sustained pressure would not have produced the intended result. Hale allowed a small breath to escape as he folded his hands behind his back again. Exactly. The holographic battlefield shifted once more, replacing the simulation with the real footage recorded by the alien cruisers in orbit. The image showed the moment when human soldiers began moving heaters across the ice toward the opposing line. The council members watched the scene again, but this time the context had changed. What at first looked like interference now looked more like adaptation. Sarenval stepped closer to the center platform, her eyes still fixed on the recording. Your decision altered the expected trajectory of the battle. Hale answered calmly. Yes. She continued studying the footage where soldiers from two different species now stood within the same circles of warmth. And as a result, she said slowly, the engagement did not end through environmental collapse. Hale nodded once more. No, it did not. The chamber remained still for several seconds before Sarenval spoke again. Instead, she said quietly, both forces survived long enough for formal withdrawal protocols to be established. Hale glanced up at the projection where the heaters glowed against the snow like small, steady suns. That was the idea. Several council members exchanged thoughtful looks. The meaning of the data was becoming harder to dismiss. Finally, Sarenval turned fully toward the human officer, standing alone at the center of the hall. Major Hale, she said carefully. According to the outcome records, the opposing force later entered negotiations following their evacuation from Velkor Prime. Hale nodded. Yes, Commander. She studied him for a moment longer before asking the question that had quietly formed across the chamber. And you believe your decision on that battlefield contributed to that result? Hale looked once more at the projection above them where soldiers from both sides shared the fragile warmth of the heaters in the middle of a frozen storm. Then he answered in the same calm voice he had used since entering the chamber. "Commander," he said, "sometimes the first step toward ending a war is proving that someone is willing to stop fighting long enough to remember why it started." The chamber remained quiet after Major Lucas Hale finished speaking, but this time the silence carried a different weight. The council members were no longer arguing about doctrine. They were studying consequences. Above the central platform, the holographic battlefield shifted again, advancing the timeline beyond the moment when the storm reached its peak over Velkor Prime. The projection now showed evacuation corridors forming across the ice. Human transport crawlers moving slowly through deep snow. Alien extraction craft descending carefully through heavy winds to retrieve their stranded forces. What had begun as an engagement between two opposing armies had ended with both sides leaving the planet alive. Judge Commander Sarenval watched the updated data scroll beside the projection. Her expression remained composed, but her voice carried a quiet note of curiosity. "Major Hale, according to the after-action reports, your battalion did not pursue the opposing fleet during their withdrawal." Hale nodded calmly. "That is correct." One of the council observers leaned forward from the upper tier. "You possessed operational advantage at that point. Their units were exhausted. Their logistics had collapsed." Hale glanced up at the projection where the alien transports lifted through the storm clouds. "Yes," he said. "We were aware." The observer tilted his head slightly. "Yet you allowed them to depart without resistance." Hale folded his hands behind his back again, standing comfortably beneath the pale glow of the projection. "Commander," he replied quietly, "once the storm broke, the battle was already over." Sarenval studied him carefully. That is not the conclusion reached by most commanders. Hale allowed a faint breath of air to escape as he looked up at the image of Velkor Prime, slowly rotating above the chamber. The frozen world looked calm now, the storm systems fading as the simulation moved forward in time. "Most commanders measure victory by who remains standing at the end of the fight," he said. "But sometimes the more important question is what happens after the fight ends." The council members listened without interruption. Hale continued speaking slowly, his voice steady enough to carry through the entire hall. 3 weeks after Velkor Prime, the opposing coalition opened a diplomatic channel through the neutral relay network. Several council members exchanged glances. The data logs beside the projection confirmed his statement. Hale gestured lightly toward the information. They requested negotiations regarding supply access and territorial boundaries, the same issues that started the conflict in the first place. One of the observers spoke quietly. "And those negotiations are ongoing?" Hale nodded once. "Yes." The chamber fell silent again as the meaning settled across the room. Sarenval stepped closer to the platform, her gaze still fixed on the slowly turning projection of the frozen planet. "Major Hale," she said carefully, "are you implying that the outcome of those negotiations was influenced by the events on that battlefield?" Hale looked up at the holographic image where the faint outlines of the heater circles were still visible in the snow. For a moment he did not answer. Then he spoke in the same calm voice he had used since the beginning of the hearing. "Commander, when two sides spend hours standing in the same storm, trying to keep each other alive, it changes the way they look at the next conversation." Several council members lowered their gaze toward the floor consoles, as if reconsidering their earlier assumptions. Sarenval remained silent for a moment longer before asking the question that had begun forming across the entire chamber. "Major Hale," she said quietly, "when you made the decision on Velkor Prime, were you thinking about diplomacy?" Hale shook his head slightly, a small smile appearing at the corner of his expression. "No, Commander," he said. "At the time I was only thinking about getting everyone off that ice before the planet decided the outcome for us." He paused briefly before adding one final thought. "Everything that happened after that was simply what people chose to do once they realized the fight had stopped. I guess the truth about that day is simpler than the council expected. Wars are usually explained with long reports and complicated strategy, but sometimes the real reason something changes is small enough to miss if you are not looking carefully." The chamber lights dimmed slightly as the holographic projection above Major Lucas Hale slowly faded from the frozen surface of Velkor Prime to a quiet star map of the surrounding sector. The storm that had once filled the sky of that world was now only a recorded pattern inside the archives of the Galactic Council. Judge Commander Sarenval stood motionless for several seconds while the data concluded its final playback. The chamber had begun this hearing with accusations and suspicion, yet what remained now felt closer to reflection than judgment. One by one the council consoles stopped scrolling as the analysis finished. The numbers had confirmed what the recordings already showed. The battle on Velkor Prime had not been decided by superior tactics or overwhelming force. It had been decided by a decision that no doctrine had predicted. Sarenval finally turned away from the star map and looked directly at the human officer still standing calmly at the center of the platform. Major Hale had not moved during the entire review. His posture remained relaxed, his hands folded behind his back the same way they had been since the hearing began. The judge commander studied him with an expression that was no longer skeptical. It was thoughtful now, almost curious. "Major Lucas Hale of the United Earth Defense Fleet," she said slowly, her voice echoing gently across the chamber. The council convened this hearing under the belief that Earth had violated the established combat doctrines of the Interstellar Coalition. She paused briefly while several council members watched from the upper tiers. "However, the records show that your actions did not prolong the conflict on Velkor Prime. In fact, the opposite appears to be true." Hale did not interrupt. He simply listened. Sarenval continued. "The opposing coalition survived the engagement. 3 weeks later, they initiated negotiations through neutral channels. 6 weeks later, a provisional ceasefire agreement was established. The projection above them shifted again, displaying the current diplomatic corridor that now crossed the same sector where the frozen battlefield once existed. A thin line of light connected the systems of two civilizations that had previously been at war. The chamber remained completely silent as the implications settled across the council. Sarenval stepped closer to the platform edge. "Major Hale," she said quietly, "the council cannot identify any formal regulation within the combat charter that prohibits preserving the survival of opposing forces during extreme environmental conditions." Hale gave a small nod. "That is correct, Commander." A faint ripple of restrained amusement moved through several observers seated along the upper rows. The judge commander allowed the silence to linger for a moment longer before delivering the final conclusion of the hearing. "Therefore," she said calmly, "this council finds no violation of combat law in the actions taken by the United Earth Defense Fleet on Velkor Prime." The star map above them slowly dimmed until only a few distant lights remained floating across the chamber ceiling. Sarenval looked at the human officer one last time. "Major Hale," she said, "it appears the doctrine of your species contains principles not yet fully understood by this council." Hale allowed a small, quiet smile to appear as he glanced briefly toward the fading projection of the frozen world. Then he answered with the same simple honesty he had carried since the hearing began. "Commander," he said, "we did not write those principles for war." The last stars above the chamber flickered softly as the system powered down. "We wrote them," he finished gently, "so that even in war we would remember how to stop